it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel is housing. So as we know, housing affordability, which we kind of invented as a problem here in California, but has been spreading, New York has had it for a long time too, but basically is spreading throughout the country. This is not, the saying is, things happen first in California and then they happen elsewhere, and often those are good things, but sometimes there are not good things. This is an example of a not good thing, and so we're gonna have a panel about this, moderated by my colleague, Lynne Boorn. Lynne joined our faculty 5 years ago, coming to us after getting her PhD at the University of Cincinnati. The thing that makes Lynne unusual is she was extremely successful in the real estate business before she went on to get a PhD and come to the academic side. So she's one of our rare faculty members who actually knows what she's talking about. And that she's done it as well as taught it. She's an amazing teacher. And we have with her two people who have thought very hard about housing issues here in Southern California. I will let Lynne introduce our panel. Lynne, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And if I take on too much of a professorial tone, I apologize in advance. But this was a classroom in which I was teaching 90 sophomores in the spring. And so I'm already having like flashbacks. But so far, everyone looks like they're looking at me and not at their phone. So that's a really good place for us to start, right? Anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce Jen McElyea, and she is with Ethos, and Ben Winter, who is with Linc Housing. Both have a tremendous amount of experience in the housing side of things. Jen was actually on more of the financing and equity investing side of things before she started her development firm with some other folks. And then Ben has been both on the financing, on the policy side, on the public side, on the private side. So a wide range for his background to kind of bring all of these ideas to bear when we're talking about kind of the housing. So, you know, I took the question literally when Richard said, okay, you know, we want you to have this panel to answer the question, is housing an intractable problem? And so the first thing I wanted to do is just have us speak for a moment, just breaking out, what do we mean by problem? Right? What is the problem statement? Because we probably all have our own general interpretation of like, what do we think the problem is? You know, is it, you know, the supply, is it affordability, et cetera? So I wanted to chat with the panel, but I think, you know, as we open up to Q&A, there probably will be a little bit more of a dialogue, and I don't know that Richard will be able to refrain from joining in too at some point. So, but when we talk about housing and what we mean by like, what is the housing problem? I'd love to get your feedback about, you know, what do we describe that as? What do we think that kind of problem is?
I'm happy to kick it off. Thank you for having me here. I was a student here for my master's nearly 20 years ago, so good to be back. But, you know, I think you can answer that question multiple ways. I mean, certainly there is a shortage of housing that people can afford. So I would say that's sort of like one bucket of the problem. I don't want to take all the potential answers here, but I'd say in my mind, is there a fundamental issue with housing being an investment product? Because how do you keep something affordable if it's predicated on generating a financial return? And so I think there are a couple ways we can tackle this, you know, discussion and sort of think about, you know, how do you keep something affordable if you are constantly expecting it to appreciate in value and continue to generate returns on your investment? So I'll let Ben jump in.
No, that's a good way to sum it up. I mean, when I think about is housing an intractable problem, the answer is yes. Intractable means hard and difficult to solve. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't have hope that there aren't solutions that can work, but I think that last comment you said is really, I think, the underlying reason why it's intractable. You know, I just heard a phrase from our last speaker. He said, oh, there's a couple markets that are overbuilding. Right? And you think about what overbuilding from whose perspective, for who, and that's usually the equity investors, right? So the moment that builders and their equity investors start to do a good job and you start to see movement downward in rents, which is what we as an affordable housing space want to see, and policymakers especially, then they start to pull out. And so that's why you need that government intervention, especially at the federal level. Unfortunate that entitlements are so constraining, because I'd love for housing to be a part of that entitlement bucket, because there is, you need that extra incentive to keep building, especially at that lower income level. And then the other intractable piece, I mean, is the structural racism in the housing marketplace for generations that have kind of prevented people from accumulating wealth through home ownership opportunities that have just compounded itself over time till you get to a place where you really do have such a disparity in who's experiencing the housing problem and in which ways.
Well, and so maybe let's dig into that a little bit more when we talk about affordability, because I think there are so many. I mean, if I was to create like a visual for everyone, we'd almost need to create kind of a matrix, right? Because there is this supply issue, there's an affordability issue, right? There's a spatial issue. So which markets are we talking about, right? Which groups are we talking about housing for? Is it the higher income, middle, lower income, right? So we've got a lot of different, like, who are the potential owners or renters in these, right? So we kind of, and then we layer onto that the spatial issues, because if you looked in particular markets, you know, where there has been people migrating out of those markets into some of these more sought after markets, right? You might not experience the housing shortages the same kind of way, or affordability. So first off, I think maybe let's just cut it a couple of different ways. So I don't have this like on my list of stuff. We talked about it. So when we think about the renting and the owning, I think that's a really big issue too. You know, here in Los Angeles, we've got that magnified. So when we talk about LA, know that it's at kind of the forefront of this, but it's you know, clearly rippling its way across many different markets. So we think about the rental, we think about the ownership. Let's talk first about ownership. So what are some of the key issues behind that? Like, why do we think that just it's not going to happen, or we've got these big problems? And we can start kind of here, but obviously think kind of broadly.
Ownership? Why do we have this problem? Well, I mentioned a little bit.
Yeah,
there's some histories here that have made it incredibly challenging, especially for Black, Latin, and Indigenous people to own homes. It's interesting. I spent my last job before coming to Linc. I was at HUD and was on the Biden transition team. And the first executive order from the president was an order that on racial equity. So he asked every single department to look at its own history and its own policies and figure out what are the ways that we can start to redressing that. And so HUD is, you know, even HUD, a department that always thinks of itself as in the forefront of promoting equity in the marketplace, had to think about, well, how did our own policies help create this problem? And what are the things that we can do now? So you'll start to see some interesting things coming out of the federal government, especially on home ownership, which is where they decided to start first, to think about how we can close that massive racial home ownership gap, which is kind of interesting to look at.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, to piggyback off of that, it's sort of like there are the people who are homeowners, and then there is a huge barrier to entry into home ownership, and a lot of that is just, again, historical policy that favored certain people over others. And then also, at this juncture, single-family homes are not being produced in a lot of these areas. So in LA, you know, there's a big focus on not, first of all, there isn't land for more single-family home ownership. And then, in general, there's a lot of NIMBYism around densifying existing single-family home ownership communities, or single-family low-density communities. And so that's been a challenge, but also the production of potentially condominiums, which would facilitate home ownership. There are financing challenges with condominium capital stack production and risk, and perceived sort of desire for investors to be in the condo market. So there are so many elements that are disparate across the spectrum that make this very hard to tackle with just sort of one policy approach or one zoning change. It has to be sort of really looked at from a number of angles in order to make it more feasible for the broader population to even have a chance to get their toe into homeownership.
Yeah.
I think in policymakers and even practitioners, we always kind of like put ourselves in either the rental bucket or the homeownership bucket.
Right.
I've been in the rental bucket for a long time. That's primarily what I've worked on. But it gets me thinking, like, we forget that these two, it's one market, it's one housing market, and they're very intimately connected. So if we do provide more opportunities for first-time home buyers, especially for renters, families that have been renters for generations, that eases up the pressure on the rental side. And it becomes easier to find an apartment to rent with a voucher for an extremely low-income person. So there's a lot of affordable homes out there for lower-income people, but they're not available because you have higher-income people living in them. So that strategies like that to find a way to increase the supply of do infill multifamily condo development would be great. Maybe we need a federal low-income housing tax credit for condos, right? Not just for rental housing to help encourage that growth there. And stop subsidizing the exurban development of single-family lots that also has a carbon impact, an environmental impact.
Yeah. Well, and also separates middle and lower income families and households further from where their jobs are, right? Because we don't have a lot of the transportation and mobility in place. Interesting. I mean, it was my hope as we were talking about kind of thinking about ownership from the standpoint of zoning. So there are zoning constraints from that perspective. There are financing constraints when we think about, we've got this idea around single family as opposed to other kinds of denser options. So just even the capital aspects of it create some problems. It also rolls into these issues of NIMBYism. So we come across it in multiple ways when we think about the ownership side of things. So now flipping to the part where I know, we've spent more time on the rental side of things. What do we think are some of those root causes when we talk about the rental affordability side? And remembering, always that housing, it's two sides of the same coin. So there's the ownership side and the rental, and we're kind of always moving back and forth between the two, but yeah.
I will say that the city and the state has really made some big leaps in streamlining the entitlement process for affordable housing, but costs have come up significantly, and that's just out of our control commodities pricing, and labor is very, very expensive. So even if your cost of production is reduced because the speed at which you can get to your permits and the cost of capital has come down because the risk perception around getting to your permits faster has fallen, you now have to deal with higher construction costs, now higher interest rates. But I'd say one of the big things that I'm surprised people don't talk about more is when Proposition 13 was passed, which capped how much property tax could be extracted from building and property owned and homeowners. It limited it to 1% of your assessed value, and the assessment was fixed at whatever the transaction price was when the property was sold or bought. And it can only increase by 2%. The assessed value can only increase by 2% per year. So that limited the tax pool that the state has to fund all of its public services. And so what I've seen over the last decade is really, unfortunately, that housing has become the vehicle to produce all these other public goods. So when you pull a permit, you're paying for schools, you're paying fees to build schools, you're paying fees to build infrastructure, you're paying fees to build roads and the sewer and pay the police and the fire department. You're often mandated to add a child care component. You're mandated to do a local hire program. So now you have to provide apprenticeships. And so there's this metaphor analogy that's always being used by calling housing sort of this Christmas tree that they put a bunch of ornaments on, and now it's like falling over because there are all these ornaments that are being tacked onto it. And that's part of why there's so much expense associated with housing production. And unfortunately, it's like, how do you fund these services another way? Where's the money going to come from if you don't have housing do it? But it's like, where do you prioritize your public spending? I think that's a large part of the conversation.
Yeah. I'm smiling because I'm remembering this conflict that I have with a city up north. I won't name which one. For this issue right here is they wanted to underground the utilities in the back of our lot, and to save 2 parking stalls. I'm like, okay, this is probably going to cost about $1 million. So it's really $500,000 per parking stall that you guys are asking for. But they said, no, we want the parking. But what they really wanted is this infrastructure upgrades, right? So I'm like, okay, sure, we can do that. Can you give us $1 million? Sure, here's $1 million. So instead of doing it themselves, it's almost easier to actually give the funding to affordable housing developers to do it sometimes, which is interesting. But I mean, one of the biggest challenges, I guess, for affordable rental housing is really the gap subsidy, right? We have the limited 9%, 4% low-income housing tax credits from the feds, and very small amount of gap subsidy from the home program. And that only produces what, in the city of LA, maximum 1,000? It's a block grant program that goes directly to cities and states that then they use to fund a whole bunch of different kind of housing programs that they get to define how to do it. It can do first-time home buyer loans, or it can go to developers like us to help buy down, basically, substitute our debt for really soft loans to drive down the rents even more. So that only produces, about 1,000 units in the city of LA per year. In the county, we need about 400,000. We have a deficit of 400,000 affordable rental homes. So we're never going to meet that
statistic is, just think about that. I mean, if you think, so it's 400,000 relative to 1,000.
Yeah. So that's why I'm remembering that first slide, the pie chart of federal spending. It's just like, I see it's very clear in my mind the solution here is just more funding. Of course, that's the solution from an affordable housing developer. But if we're not going to get it from the feds and the state, and the locals need to do it. So in the last 10 years, we've raised taxes locally, like you saw on the other chart, to pay for affordable housing. And we've more than tripled our production of affordable housing because of those resources, which has been great. We've been going, we've been doing lots of development, especially here, all of us have. But all of those sources are beginning to dry up because they're all time-bound, right? It's a bond for 10 years. It's a program for 5 years. Those are all dried up. And now we've got a deficit at the state level, and the statewide proposition for funding is expiring. So where's that money going to come from? So expect something on the ballot again in 2024 to help replace some of that. But it's just that constant struggle of we need that gap funding because the cost of debt is too high and there's not enough subsidized equity out there. So we need somebody else to pick up the other tab.
And if I could add to that, because I'll say I spent nearly, 15 years on the private equity side doing just traditional multifamily, and then started getting more into the subsidized affordable housing space. And my head exploded because I'm like, wait a second, so you're building something where your cash flow, your NOI is nothing. I mean, you barely can cover your debt service. So you're like, okay, well, there's no return to equity. So you're building something that's worth less than what it costs to build. There are no equity investors. You're getting the money for free from the government. And then you have this alternative scenario where, to your earlier point, if you just built and built and built and built, and you met the market where supply and demand equalized, then equity investors who are in the market to build for a return don't want to be involved anymore because suddenly now you're building to maybe a 2 or 3% yield that correlates to inflation just pushing your rents up over time. Because what you're really, when I put on my private equity hat, I'm like, okay, we're investing in an apartment because we believe not only there will be some growth in rents because of inflation, but we want to beat inflation, so we actually have a return on our investment. So we're banking on the fact that this is supply constrained, and rents are going to go up because of market conditions, not because rents normally just intrinsically go up, and that's part of the problem. And so we have this issue where the production of market rate housing is limited to producing a return on investment, which is predicated on there being a supply issue, and then you have limited public subsidy to just fund projects that don't have any yield and are worth less than what they cost. And so it's like, how do we navigate this? The reason I started my company was really trying to see if there's some way to sort of bridge the two, where you maybe take some of the subsidy to almost encourage market rate participants to take a lower yield in exchange for, maybe less risk, exactly. And maybe there's some, happy medium there. But it is, in that regard, I think it's an intractable problem because for those two reasons, limited subsidy, and you have a market-driven approach on the other end that is based on there being a supply issue.
Yeah. Well, and I think that came through a couple times already, and that's really important to consider. That's not something you're going to hear in just every discussion about the housing issue, right? Like, I've got my stats here that I was going to roll out about how many housing units are we, short nationally, because it ranges anywhere from, say, 1.5 million to 7.8 million when I was doing my quick back of the envelope scroll of like, who's saying what in terms of, just how much housing are we short nationally. But that really is the rub, right? When we think about kind of where the market is and what the market objective is relative to where we need to be from just an affordability, people living their lives and having the housing that they need across all different income levels, right? And they're banging up against each other, right, because of these issues. And we see this then parlayed through when we think about zoning, right? So, the NIMBYism and we are very focused on kind of a single family model, but in places like Los Angeles and places really all over the country, the single family model from a zoning perspective doesn't really work. But then we have that, well, I don't want to not have it be single family anymore because I'm happy my house price has doubled or whatever that is, right? And I don't really want to live next to super dense housing. So it kind of works its way through all of these different layers, right? So I guess, we've got a couple of different things that we've already kind of talked about, but can we talk a little bit more about some of the tools maybe to help address some of the supply issues? We kind of touched on a little bit maybe with like the condo piece, but can we talk about that some more? So how would we hit it from that side of things?
I'm happy to jump in. You're gonna have to go on this little journey with me, but one of the things we're doing is we're buying older vintage market rate housing that is naturally affordable, and I kind of hate that term because there's nothing natural about it. It's older vintage, it's under amenitized, oftentimes it has code compliance issues, but it's cheaper because it's just not as nice as the new product. And we've been buying that and partnering with the government in acquiring those properties to convert them to affordable housing. And the way we can make that work with traditional yield-seeking private equity is that if you partner with the government, you're not paying property tax. And so the savings on that big operating expense line item allows you to keep the rents affordable, yet still generate enough of a yield to work for pension funds and insurance companies who are looking for really just stable, more fixed income type returns. Now, that doesn't help the supply side because what you're doing is you're not creating net new housing, but you're taking what historically would have been sort of a good value add investment where over time the market would have been driven to acquire this property, clean it up, add amenities, and slowly market to market, now taking away that natural affordable stock and hopefully creating an opportunity for there to be more demand for the market rate side production, which is generally more streamlined and more efficient than producing affordable housing. So said another way, you could acquire this older vintage housing at, call it like $200,000 a door, and the net present value of the foregone tax benefit is about $60,000 a door of loss to the public sector versus if that stock is lost, to produce one new unit of affordable housing in California is somewhere between $500,000 to $1 million. And you can produce new market rate housing at, call it, $400,000 to $600,000 a door. So it's sort of shifting where resources are going to be at least focused on using public subsidy and private equity in more effective ways. But that's like just one avenue. I mean, I think we need like
don't forget about preservation, right?
Yes, exactly.
So
I don't know if we're taking questions.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard that right. So it costs more money to build public housing per unit than private housing?
Yes.
Yeah, almost double. I had my very first speaker, I teach market analysis here, and so I had my very first affordable housing speaker come and talk to my students. And I said, well, why don't you bring up your pro forma, right? So he's going through his pro forma, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line, $900,000 per unit.
But
And it's
as
almost
a
double,
nonprofit
right?
affordable housing
No, but that
developer.
he's asking why.
Yeah.
But it's important to get, because again, like my students were just all kind of like, wait a second, is that a typo? Because we'd had other people come in and they were looking at more kind of, on average, called around kind of $400,000 to $500,000 per unit in this market, right? So it is really, glad you asked the question, because it is crucial to understand.
But I also think, I mean, the product is a little different,
Yeah.
right? So let's take permanent supportive housing, for example. Permanent supportive housing, especially for people who are formerly experiencing homelessness, isn't just housing, right? It also has a ton of room for services. It has for case management. So a lot of community space, because you're reintegrating people into housing and you want them to stay. The purpose isn't to have them come and leave. It's to come and stay forever if they want, right? And you're building community. So and it also has a lot of wear and tear. The OpEx are really, really high in these buildings, so much that our NOIs are like non-existent and indeed negative in some of these deals. But so they're not think of it more like infrastructure for the housing social safety net, especially the PSH. So that's one reason, I had to talk a lot about Proposition HHH, which was a measure we passed in LA City that raised $1.2 billion for housing to build 10,000 of these units. And of course, everybody looks at the comparison like, well, it just doesn't make sense, but you just have to realize it's building like the train lines of our homeless safety net, if you think
Well, and some of it too gets to your Christmas tree point, right? Where, everybody's putting, so there's a lot of fees that are loaded on to that housing. So everyone, if I'm getting new market tax credit money, if I'm getting money from, different other funding resources, all of those fees for those programs are also rolled into that. It also has to be all union and I forget the other term, but it's like experienced prevailing wage or experienced something. Yeah, and so there's the cost is more, just the labor costs are higher too. So there's a lot of different aspects that kind of add up.
It's an incredibly inefficient funding system too.
Yeah.
Like even just to fund new construction through a tax credit program, just is not very efficient. We're not right off the bat. We're not getting a dollar for dollar of that value. So and then you have to layer on all this other stuff. Like there's like $1 million of extra transactional costs just for like 4%.
Yeah. And not to
Could that be, apart from the social services, could that be fixed somehow?
Yeah.
Like if Ben Winter were in charge, how much could he cut the cost of building?
Well, Ben Winter would have to go to Congress and change a lot of federal laws, and I don't think I'm going to be electable.
Well, I don't answer for what Ben Winter could do, but I can say, again, to sort of draw a comparison between traditional capital stack versus affordable housing capital stack. Like, you build a regular market rate apartment building, you have your debt and you have your equity. That's it. And the problem with what happened in the subsidized affordable housing capital stack production over time is that costs got way too high. Historically, you could finance it with just tax-exempt bonds and tax credit equity. But as costs ballooned, those two sources were not sufficient to fully build your capital stack. And so when Ben says we don't have enough soft subsidy, that's really just like gap financing that you have to get from like all these disparate sources. I liken it to applying to college and you need to get a bunch of scholarships to fill your cost of tuition. And so you're like, oh, I need to get this grant from this group over here. That's gonna be like $2 million for my $15 million capital stack. And then I'm gonna apply for this other grant over here. And not to derail us too long, but all of these grants have different requirements. So this grant's like, well, you need to serve, this type of population. And this grant over here says, but we also want you to feature this type of service. And this other grant says, well, we prioritize 3 bedrooms. And the application cycles for the different grants do not align. So you're like, over the course of maybe 3 years, applying for different things, you don't get them all. So you're like, well, I have to apply to more than I think I need, but you can disqualify yourself if you apply to too many. And every time you apply, you have to have a new market study, a new phase 1, all these expensive reports. It's insane.
Well, and that gets back to the supply issue.
And if
Yeah.
you
Talk about-
purchase that, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
And if you purchase that property with an AC loan,
Yeah, you're paying
You're
interest
paying interest.
the whole time.
So at the state level, right, the state gives out their fund. They have an application once a year through the Supernova, is what they call it. It sounds really exciting. And it's like a game you want to play, but it's not a game you want to play. And if it's incredibly competitive. So last year, it was oversubscribed from $5 to $1, right? $5 requested for every $1 available. We put in 3 or 4 applications, didn't get any. And then
we didn't get any.
and then you have to wait an entire year. So that site, even though it's fully entitled, because you have to be fully entitled before you apply, by the way, because the state's like, all right, spend a bunch of money, nonprofit affordable housing developers, to hire all your consultants and get it through the entitlement process, get it ready, and then, okay, wait another year. Oh, good try next time. Oh, try again. So that's why
And your costs have gone up like
costs
10%
keep going up, and it
every
gets to
year.
the point where, dang, the cost to carry is so high. So sometimes, 2/3 of our pipeline is actually publicly owned land, because I just can't find private landowners that are willing to hang out that long for super cheap without too many releases. If y'all know any, please give them my name. It's bwinter@linkhousing.org. But that's why we have to rely on public land, which, by the way, if it's public land, then you got a lot of extra bells and whistles. Because they get to demand on it. Like, I even entitled a project through SB 35, which was supposed to be the state bill that talk about solutions, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
streamlines processes, makes a project to be entitled by right without getting challenged through a CEQA lawsuit. But so it helped. It sped it up.
What CEQA is, because it's a national crowd.
It's like y'all heard about NEPA, the environmental review at the national level. We got one here. It's called CEQA.
Yeah, and places like Florida, others will have comparable things. But in California, in the Los Angeles area, if you have something that is quote unquote entitled or by right, like it says, okay, you're allowed to build X amount on this piece of property, it's not necessarily like that, right? By the time you go through the various community reviews and all of those things. So this was really an attempt to make it much more, if something was zoned for commercial and you want to turn it into multifamily, then boom, you can do it and move through the process much more quickly without going through these additional zoning or additional approval.
But so we could entitle it, but because it's publicly owned land, they could ask for a whole bunch of other stuff on it, right? So it wasn't actually a streamlined process, only on paper, so we get to the funding application.
Yeah.
So to answer Richard's question, I mean, if you had a centralized source of all the different funding sources and it was predictable, because, oh, by the way, every year the soft subsidies change. They might be like, this year we just don't have any, or next year we have $500 million, or next year, we're in a budget deficit, we have $50 million. And so you can't even plan effectively for how much might be available, or how competitive it might be, or what kind of product you should be getting designed. So if it were more predictable and if it were more centralized, that certainly would help.
But that said, still though, I think it would still cost more, because it's not an apples to apples comparison, especially for PSH. We're not, and our quality of housing are super high. They're beautiful buildings. We build them to last long, because we're long-term owners. We're not building and flipping and getting out as quickly as possible. We're providing the services on site. And we want to be good neighbors to everybody around, because there's a lot of NIMBYism. So we want to come in with the best looking property. In a lot of the neighborhoods we build in, it's the nicest properties in the building, in the neighborhood. And people feel proud about that. And we want to be part of that. So it'll never be cheaper, because I don't want it to be, unless you build tiny homes for people who are experiencing homelessness. And that's not what we do, because that's not housing, right?
Well,
People
but it
deserve a
is
higher
good.
quality.
I'm glad we talked through all of that, because I think especially for you all as potential investors or thinking about, I invest in multifamily, I'm looking at some of these other programs. Why are they so much more? Is it just because these people don't know what they're doing, or, so it's good to note. You had a question up there?
Yeah, stepping back to the initial definition of the intractable problem.
Yes.
Putting aside homeless people who are otherwise on the street, because there's a clear benefit to society of getting them off the street into safe housing. For everybody else who's looking for affordable housing and can't find it, but they're living somewhere safe, their parents' basement, they're doubling up with friends, has there been any work done on the benefit to society of creating this housing? Because at a time of increasingly scarce public resources, it seems like you're going to have to make a really good case for applying the resources here and not to education or infrastructure or somewhere else. How do you measure the numbers?
That's a very good question.
I think it's a great question. I don't think it's, personally, I haven't seen anything that measures it in either direction. There's a lot of talk about what is the cost of doing nothing and what is the cost of making a big investment in housing. I'd say, you know, in LA, it's not just the homeless population. I think getting people off the streets is its own category of urgency. But there's also, just looking at it from an environmental standpoint, you have people, I think there's a stat that like 90% of LAPD does not live in LA County, or city of LA, sorry. And it's because they cannot afford to live where they work. And so not only does that impact how well they do their job, because they have these massive commutes, but also environmental issues with everybody driving in from other places. And I think you mentioned earlier, maybe Richard, that people don't have their support networks where they grew up. They're all having to relocate into the exurbs, and that's breaking down sort of communities and sort of networks that we need to survive in, you know, a two-parent working household that it takes to actually afford to live here. And so it's all these other elements. And I get frustrated when I think about, you know, when people say, well, what should be the return on investment in housing? Because I'm like, gosh, you produce housing. There is so much social benefit to society by having someone live where they work, have housing security so they can focus on getting a job, getting educated, taking care of their kids. That isn't measured. And I'm hopeful that, you know, unless this whole ESG conversation gets derailed because of politics, that we focus more on what is impact. You know, how do we quantify impact in a way that's beyond just, you know, we produce this unit of housing, because there is more to it. And maybe the converse is true too. Maybe we overvalue what we think the impact of housing is. But I'd be inclined to say that in LA, access to housing is so much more than just shelter and a place to sleep.
But I would think it would be, you know, clearly, how much, 10 minutes? I think you raise a really crucial issue, because if we just think about even in terms of, and this is really across many, many urban areas, but when people are always on the verge of losing their housing, right? It's not just the other stresses, but it's, you know, kids are having to move from school to school. They don't have access to the, you know, health or the social networks, or, you know, we talked about kind of that spatial mismatch of like the housing is here and the jobs are here. And so what is the cost, not just environmentally, not just in terms of time or hours lost, not, you know, all of those different aspects. So it's a really valuable question, but clearly none of us answered it because I don't know that there have been metrics. So
Well,
good
one more-
note to self, right? Some research.
One more thing that, you know, some HUD has done, they have a whole research arm, right? And they manage really long-term studies and, you know, quasi-experimental studies that kind of look at the impact of affordable, not only affordable, but stable housing, and the impact of where that affordable and stable housing is in terms of neighborhoods of opportunity, right? So if you can provide a family, a lower income family, with high quality, stable, affordable housing in a high opportunity neighborhood with good schools, low crime, where people feel safe to get out and walk and exercise, they have better health outcomes. And especially kids end up having higher wages and have higher opportunity, right? So there are there's research out there that teases out that causality between really high quality housing, where it's located, very important, and then the benefits to society, because people who are more productive, live healthier lifestyles, and can go to school, that's better for the economy overall.
So with
it is
this
out there.
teeny last little bit of time, you know, we started kind of already having the discussion a little bit when we were just chatting amongst ourselves. But so with the audience that we have, the question that I asked, and it also can kind of float out to the audience, but do you think ESG will help provide capital to expanding housing supplies. All of you are kind of living in that world of, ESG and what are the different requirements, what are the different aspirations and goals of it. And so I put it to the panel, but I also put it out to you guys too. But yeah.
Well, you heard my commentary on this earlier in our little discussion. I quoted an article that just came out where Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made a statement, I think it was yesterday, saying he's ashamed to be associated with ESG. It's been hijacked as part of sort of the political, discussion around should capital be used for social benefit, particularly pension fund money, which is public money, and how do you decide, whether the mandate should be being a fiduciary and getting the highest return on that dollar versus, doing good, and who gets to decide, what doing good is. And so I struggle with people saying, impact capital or ESG money is the solution, because it's like, what is impact capital? In many cases, it's just branding. We have a lot of impact investors that we speak with whose return expectations are the same as our non-impact investors. But I do think it goes back to the comment about what do we value in our investments? Is it just the financial return strictly on a piece of paper? What is your IRR and yield on cost? Or is it these positive externalities that might be happening because of your investment that we just don't know how to quantify appropriately? Because I always think, if you own a Class A office building, but you're in a submarket where there's a tremendous amount of homelessness, and now you have extra security costs, and maybe your tenants don't want to come to work, and you're losing occupancy. Well, I sort of see it as like a portfolio solution that you're investing in affordable housing or homeless housing to just bring up the overall quality of the experience of being in this Class A office. And so that's how I think about impact capital. But I think the European models and European mandates are ahead of where the US is. They have much more strict definitions around what impact is. I think it's still very nebulous here, and now it's become politicized, so I get very nervous about the direction it's going.
Well, I can see from the nonprofit affordable housing perspective, all the capital we chase are subsidized programs, but a couple nonprofit developers, the big ones, have started issuing taxable bonds at the corporate level and not just at the project level. And so, they've been able to raise like $100 million just because of these ESG metrics. And that $100 million is really flexible. They can do whatever they want with that money. Well, not whatever they want, but to grow, right? It's much more flexible for us. So it's challenging. In order to get there, you need to have about $1 billion in assets, which we're almost there. And you got to get rated, which is very costly and time consuming. But if you got a good CFO like us, Dana Moore, it can help get there. So I'm hopeful that can, at least give us a different kind of source of equity that we can tap into, especially for acquisitions, so we can go out and buy private. Yeah, and scale our work, because we're stuck. We can only do so much with public land. We need more flexible capital to acquire land and move it towards development.
So I think we hopefully have time for a question, right? So can we open up? Yeah, Gloria?
Have you thought of co-living? It's being practiced in Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
I can say it's a solution, but I've struggled with real estate being somewhat backward looking, where a lot of people are like, well, we need like 10 years of track record to know that this has, performance that is, predictable, and this is a typology that is scalable. And so we've struggled with sort of selling the story around it. And I think it's challenging in the US. There haven't been that many success stories. And you're right, in Asia and Europe, there have been many, but there's so many just social dynamics that are unique to different locations that it's hard to convince an investor to do something that's like new and novel.
Any other questions from the crew?
Yeah. We've heard a little bit about the mansion tax, and I'm just curious, maybe your quick point of view on it and whether or not that helps you in your world.
I hope so. I don't know. So I don't work for the city anymore, so I don't keep my finger on the pulse of revenues and how the rollout of some of these things. But my understanding is that I think the revenue collection is going to be much lower than what the campaign said. So every little bit helps. Yes, we need it, at least from my perspective. And will it tank the real estate economy in Los Angeles? I don't know. I mean, hopefully any extra tax can get borne out of the land values, but then you need the landowners to actually see that themselves. So I guess it's TBD.
Well, and we had also heard that, a different way to measure it, though, is that if it is pushing values down in the long term, then you kind of undo it, because then the base going forward for those assessed values eats into the fact that you got that money on a one-time shot, right? So I think that's one of the challenges.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Another issue about that one from a public policy perspective is it's not going to be a very predictable revenue source, right? So what I really love to see for a lot of reasons is like an operating source, an operating subsidy that's subsidizing what it costs to run a building versus what the tenant can pay, even well below market rate. It's fine that we can use that operating subsidy to get debt. And so if you've got a revenue source like ULA, it just kind of goes like that. You can't really predict that out on an operating source. No lender's gonna lend to that. So I would rather just see a 20-year commitment from the feds for project-based vouchers. It's my preference, if I could have one.
I'll add one comment on ULA. I think it's like you need to have a balance. It's so extreme that it is chilling investors on participating in LA entirely.
Yeah.
So it's like nobody wants to sell, people don't want to buy. And there's also this concern that's like, well, what's next? Like, what's the next regulation? And so, I mean, we have a lot of people who are just like, it's not worth it to go to California anymore, because we just don't know what other really extreme penalty is going to come out of the woodwork. And the challenge, as you all know, for making investments is predictability around, where you're going to potentially have negative exposure to your investment. And it's very hard to feel confident in California that there isn't something that's going to come out of the woodwork, that even if you underwrote your deal very well and you predicted maybe market conditions as close to reality as possible, you could get something out of left field that really damages your opportunity from just a policy standpoint. And that's, I think, really challenging to get people, to get comfortable with.
So I think we're probably at time, aren't we? So thank you so much to our panel. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys.
And thanks for having us.